She was just a 14-year-old black girl flying alone for the first time. But by the end of the flight, the entire crew would be on their feet. Federal agents would storm a cabin, and one powerful woman's life would unravel before the wheels even touched the ground. This is not just a story about first class and privilege. It's about how quiet cruelty builds, how a smile can cut deeper than a slap, and how justice sometimes arrives in complete silence. In a world where skin color still decides who gets questioned and who gets believed, she was marked the moment she sat down. But what no one knew, not the flight attendants, not the passengers, and especially not the woman in 2B, was that she wasn't the only one on that plane. You think you know where this is going. You don't. Like the video if this story grips you, subscribe for more real justice, and comment where you're watching from. We want to hear your voice. Arielle Thorne boarded the plane alone. Her small fingers curled tightly around the boarding pass, as if it were armor. She had memorized her seat. 2A, window side, first class, like a password to a world she was only just beginning to be allowed into. The overhead bins gleamed in polished chrome as she walked down the plush, muted carpet of the first-class cabin, her shoes making no sound, but her presence seeming to echo in the silence anyway. Adults glanced up from tablets and champagne flutes, their expressions momentarily shifting, curiosity, then dismissal, as the 14-year-old passed. She kept her eyes forward. Her father had always told her, keep your back straight, your voice calm, and your purpose clear. The rest is noise. Arielle reached her seat and slid into 2A, carefully placing her satchel under the seat in front of her and pulling out the slim novel she'd promised herself she'd finally finish during the flight. But before she could read a word, a voice like honey over ice drifted from beside her. Hi, sweetheart. I think you're in the wrong place. Arielle turned slowly, already recognizing the tone, not concern, but condescension dressed up in civility. Sitting in 2B, crossing her legs with the confidence of someone who always got her way, was a woman in her 50s with perfectly blow-dried blonde hair, a tight Chanel blazer, and lips curved in a smile too polished to be sincere. I know this seat can look inviting, she said, gesturing vaguely toward Arielle's spot, but first class isn't exactly the summer camp section. Arielle blinked once, twice, and replied in the calm, practiced tone she had learned from years of needing it. My seat is 2A. You can check. She held out the boarding pass. The woman's eyes barely flicked toward it. Oh, I'm sure that's what they told you, sweetie, she said, already turning to flag a passing flight attendant. But people get confused all the time, especially, well, young travelers. The flight attendant, a slim woman with a forced smile and tired eyes, approached, and the woman pounced. We've got a situation here. This young lady seems to think she's in the right place, but clearly there's been a mix-up. The attendant extended a hand to Arielle. May I see your ticket, please? Arielle gave it to her without a word. The attendant scanned it, frowned, then looked back at the manifest. Her voice lowered. She's correct. Seat 2A. Fully confirmed. Huh, the woman said, voice rising just enough to be heard by nearby rows. Well, I guess that's surprising. She let the word hang there like perfume. No worries. I'm sure she'll learn the rules soon enough. She smiled again and turned back to her seat, but not before retrieving her phone, angling it subtly, and snapping a photo of Arielle mid-glance. Within seconds, her fingers were tapping, and the image landed in a group chat labeled Sky Club Divas with a caption. First class is getting real inclusive lately. She brought a lunchbox. No, really. The replies came fast and cruel. Arielle didn't say anything, didn't move, didn't react, not even when she noticed the faint shutter sound. She just turned back toward the window and clenched her book a little tighter, like it might protect her from what was coming. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane leveled into its cruising altitude, and Arielle Thorne sat motionless in her first-class seat, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead, though her gaze had long since gone unfocused. The weight of the seatbelt pressed against her hips, a subtle but steady reminder that she wasn't going anywhere, not for the next 5 hours, not from the toxic presence seated beside her. Brena Halcroft hadn't said anything since the encounter at boarding, but her silence wasn't peace, it was calculation. Her phone was back in her hand, Its screen dimly glowing as her fingers danced across the keyboard, and every few seconds, a soft vibration signaled a new message in return. Ariel didn't dare look, but she could imagine the exchange. Photos, captions, sneers typed out in champagne-dull confidence. She took a quiet breath and leaned down to retrieve the lunch bag from beneath the seat in front of her. Her mother had packed it that morning with careful hands and soft words: comfort food, sweet rice cakes, and a chicken salad wrap in a neat little box. It wasn't extravagant, but it was familiar. It was supposed to anchor her. But the bag wasn't there. Ariel blinked and reached deeper, patting the carpet with both hands. She checked again, certain it had been tucked behind her feet just before takeoff. There was nothing under the seat. No pouch, no box, no trace. Her stomach clenched, not from hunger, but from confusion sharpening into dread. She rose slightly and checked around the seat, the aisle, even behind her calves, pretending to stretch. Still nothing. Her eyes slowly tracked to Brena, who was delicately applying lip balm with the confidence of someone whose world always bent to her will. The woman hadn't moved much during takeoff, but there had been a brief moment, right after boarding, just before the cabin doors shut, when she had leaned forward, rummaged through her tote for something, then sat back with an air of complete satisfaction. Ariel hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now she did. She sat back down quietly, heart pounding, not knowing what to do. There was no proof, no camera, no witnesses, no visible evidence of the lunch even existing. She couldn't exactly press the call button and accuse the woman next to her of theft, not without sounding hysterical, not without feeding every stereotype that had ever been thrown at girls who looked like her. And so she stayed silent, shifting in her seat, her throat dry, her hands resting once again in her lap, now empty of anything familiar. 10 minutes later, Brena exhaled sharply and pressed the call button. The soft ding echoed lightly, followed by the rustle of footsteps. A new flight attendant approached, this one older, sharper in manner, her graying hair pulled into a tight chignon, her posture rigid with discipline. "Yes, ma'am," she asked, her voice clipped but professional. Brena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to create an air of exclusivity between them. "I don't want to make a scene," she said, "but there's a rather unpleasant odor coming from beneath our seats." She cast a sideways glance at Ariel without turning her head fully, the gesture expertly measured to convey suspicion without accusation. "I know it's hard to police what people bring on board these days, but it smells like something fermented, possibly fish-based. I'm quite sensitive to certain foods." The attendant nodded politely and looked toward Ariel, who stared back, stunned. "I didn't bring anything," Ariel said quickly, her voice tight but controlled. "I had something with me earlier, but it's missing." The woman tilted her head. "Missing?" "Yes," Ariel replied, pressing her palms to her knees. "It was just a packed lunch, but now it's gone. I don't know what happened to it." The attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second before bending slightly and checking under Ariel's seat. After a quick scan, she straightened up. "I don't see anything down here," she said. "May I check your personal bag, just in case?" Ariel hesitated. She felt her face warming, aware of the few heads that were already turning from neighboring seats. There was no graceful way to refuse. "Sure," she said, reaching up to the overhead compartment and pulling down her canvas backpack. She set it on her lap, unzipped it, and opened it wide for inspection. The attendant rummaged gently through the contents: a book of crosswords, a portable charger, a water bottle, a folded sweater, and a worn-out pencil case. No food, no wrappers, no spills, no scent. The woman gave a polite nod, zipped it back up, and said, "It's clean. Thank you." But her tone had shifted slightly, less warm than before, more neutral, as though the mere fact that a complaint had been lodged had diminished Ariel's status in her eyes, whether or not it was founded. "Sorry to bother you," she added to Brena, who smiled faintly and replied, "Oh, no trouble. Thank you for checking." As the attendant walked away, Brena spritzed a tiny cloud of perfume into the air between them and muttered just loud enough for Ariel to hear, "Better safe than sorry, right?" Ariel looked straight ahead, her vision blurring slightly. She was still hungry. She was still alone. And now she was marked, however subtly, however silently, as a problem. The air around her felt colder, tighter, as if the walls of her seat were slowly closing in. Brena returned to her magazine and flipped a page with deliberate ease. The attack had landed, and no one had stopped it. No one had even seen it for what it was. After a long silence, Brena stretched slightly in her seat and glanced sideways with mock interest. "So," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the armrest, "how old are you exactly?" Ariel didn't respond at first, unsure if it was a genuine question or another trap. 14, she said finally, her voice low, almost reluctant. 14. Brena repeated, her brows lifting in amused disbelief. "Wow, that's adorable." The way she said it wasn't kind. It wasn't even neutral. It was edged with something sharp and glinting. "You know," she continued, her voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby Rose to hear, "I flew alone when I was 16. But that was a different time, of course. Kids back then had manners, and sense, and supervision." Ariel stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening around the seatbelt. She wanted to respond. She wanted to say something that would cut just as clean. But every word she rehearsed felt wrong, felt dangerous. So she stayed quiet. Brena took the silence as permission to continue. "Don't get me wrong," she added, with that infuriating smile. "It's great that airlines are doing more outreach. The world needs more inclusivity, more chances for all kinds of young people to experience luxury, even if they don't quite understand the etiquette yet." Ariel turned her head slowly. "I'm not here because of outreach," she said, her voice flat but firm. Brena blinked. "Oh," she replied, feigning surprise. "Then you're not part of one of those programs? You know, the community things. Scholarship flights for underprivileged youth? They usually wear something with a logo." She trailed off and made a show of scanning Ariel's hoodie. "But I guess not all of them do. That's smart. Keeps it less obvious." The man across the aisle, a silver-haired executive with a Wall Street posture, looked up from his tablet. So did the older woman in 3C, her brow furrowing just enough to signal concern. The tension in the cabin shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like a sudden drop in air pressure. Ariel could feel the change before she saw it. People were starting to wonder, starting to question. She didn't belong, someone had said, and now others were beginning to silently agree. Brena reclined her seat a notch and sipped from a glass of white wine the attendant had delivered moments earlier, clearly relishing the taste of power far more than the drink itself. "I just assumed," she said with a shrug, "given your age and, well, everything else. You just have that look, you know, brave little achiever. It's admirable." She said achiever the way someone might say stray. It wasn't a compliment. It was containment. Ariel stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her eyes glassy but still dry. Her cheeks burned, not from embarrassment, but from the effort it took to hold everything in, to not scream, not shout, not fight. She had done nothing wrong. But in this cabin, with this woman beside her, she had been made to feel like an invader in a place she had rightfully earned. The flight attendant passed again, and Brena caught her attention with a lazy wave. "Hi again," she said sweetly. "Sorry, I just wanted to ask, are there any kid-sized headphones available?" I think she forgot hers. She nodded toward Ariel, without even looking at her. The attendant glanced at Ariel, confused. "She has her own," the woman said. "Oh," Brena replied, tilting her head. "They must be hidden. I was just trying to help." The heat from Brena's barbed comments still burned beneath her skin, but she knew better than to fan the flames. Any sign of defensiveness could be twisted, weaponized, and added to the growing pile of unspoken accusations forming around her. She had learned that long ago. Fighting back made you the problem. Staying quiet just made you invisible. And sometimes invisible was safer. Brena, meanwhile, appeared entirely at ease, legs crossed elegantly, magazine folded in her lap, half a glass of Chardonnay still balanced between two fingers. Her performance was seamless. The concerned adult, the accommodating seatmate, The woman, too refined to ever raise her voice, who nonetheless could raise someone to the ground with just a breath of implication. And then, as if on cue, she made her next move. With an airy laugh, Brena adjusted her arm, flicked the edge of her tray table, and accidentally knocked the half-full wine glass directly off its surface. The glass tilted with perfect momentum, the liquid arcing midair like a precise, rehearsed motion, before cascading down onto Ariel's canvas duffel bag beneath the seat. There was no warning, no hesitation, just a splash, the dark stain spreading instantly across the beige fabric, followed by Brena's gasp, sharp, theatrical, and just loud enough for others to turn their heads. "Oh, no," she exclaimed, drawing out the syllables with practiced shock. "I'm so sorry, darling. I didn't see your bag there." She reached down quickly, grabbing a handful of paper napkins from her seat pocket and dabbing furiously at the soaked bag before Ariel could even react. Ariel froze, instinctively pulling her legs back as Brena's hands moved over her belongings with unnecessary force, smearing wine into the fabric under the guise of assistance. "This fabric," Brena murmured with a concerned tone. "It's very absorbent, isn't it? Poor thing. Maybe next time bring something more durable. Nylon's better for travel. Or plastic. Wipeable." Ariel clenched her jaw and leaned forward, gently pulling her bag away from Brena's hands. "It's fine," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I can clean it myself." But Brena didn't release it immediately. Instead, she offered one more dab with her napkin, slow, patronizing, almost intimate, before finally letting go. "Of course," she replied, sitting back with a breathless smile. "Just trying to help. It must be hard, doing this all alone." Ariel lowered the bag onto her lap, opened the zipper slowly, and checked inside. The water bottle was intact. The notebook had caught the edge of the spill, but was mostly dry. Her extra sweatshirt had absorbed the worst of it. She wiped at it gently, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked. The attendant passed by again, pausing at the sight of the mess. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. Brena turned to her with an apologetic tilt of her head. "I made a bit of a mess," she said, her voice dripping with remorse. "Knocked over my wine by mistake. Unfortunately, some of it got onto her things." She gestured toward Ariel without actually looking at her. "I feel terrible, truly. I just didn't expect a child's backpack under the seat in first class. Usually they store those up top." Her smile was sweet. Her words were not. The attendant hesitated for a moment, looked at Ariel, then nodded. "Would you like a towel, miss?" she asked Ariel. Ariel shook her head. "No, thank you. It's fine." But the damage was done. Not to the bag. Not even to the sweatshirt. The damage was in the eyes, now watching her again, seeing her not as a passenger, but as a disruption, something disorganized, unprepared, out of place. Brena reclined slightly, folded her magazine neatly, and placed it in the seat pocket with deliberate care. She stretched once, cat-like, then sighed contentedly, as if the incident had cleansed her of whatever tension remained in her body. "You're handling this so well," she said to Ariel, without even glancing at her. "Most girls your age would have had a meltdown by now. Very mature of you. It's a rare trait." The stain on her bag remained, a silent reminder of the spill that wasn't an accident, the same way the absence of her lunch wasn't coincidence. But it wasn't just the silence that pressed in around her now, it was Brena's stillness. The woman beside her, so animated earlier, had quieted, and that was never a good sign. Ariel knew that quiet, had felt it before, in classrooms, in waiting rooms, in hallways where authority smiled but didn't see her. It was the kind of silence that came before a blow. She was proven right 2 minutes later when Brena reached into her handbag and pulled out a sleek silver laptop. With delicate fingers, she flipped it open, adjusted the angle, and navigated to a movie library. There was a brief pause, as if she were making a thoughtful choice, and then, with one small click, a barrage of sound erupted from the speakers, gunfire, screaming, the high-pitched whine of helicopters. The screen flashed rapidly, with images of war zones, firestorms, soldiers running through smoke. It wasn't background noise. It was assault. The volume was turned high, unnecessarily so, and the laptop was tilted just slightly in Ariel's direction, enough that the screen glared in the corner of her eye. Ariel flinched instinctively at the first loud burst. She turned toward Brena, startled. But Brena didn't look away from the screen. Instead, she spoke calmly, without breaking her gaze. "A little exposure to real hardship won't hurt," she said, her tone soft, almost philosophical. "It builds character." Then she smiled barely, as if she had shared a helpful lesson. Ariel said nothing. She adjusted in her seat, shifted her body away from the screen, and reached slowly for her backpack, retrieving her headphones. Her fingers worked the cord with trembling precision, plugging it into her phone and slipping the buds into her ears as quickly as possible. She selected the first playlist she could find, something instrumental and soothing, but the opening notes were barely audible before one side of the audio cut out. Confused, she reached up, only to realize the cord had been pulled just enough to disconnect from a port. She turned and saw Brena's fingers casually retreating from her side of the seat. The woman didn't even look guilty. In fact, she looked pleased. "Respect your elders, honey," Brena said sweetly, her voice just loud enough to rise above the chaos from her movie. "Don't ignore me. It's not polite." Ariel's face flushed. She didn't respond. She simply reconnected the cord, pushed the earbuds deeper into her ears, and turned her face toward the window again. The soundtrack of simulated suffering continued to blare beside her, uncaring, relentless. Brena didn't lower the volume. She didn't offer headphones. She didn't apologize. She just leaned back in her seat with the kind of relaxed posture only cruelty can afford, occasionally sipping from her wine and laughing softly at scenes Ariel couldn't see, but could feel vibrating through her bones. The other passengers didn't notice, or pretended not to. No one said anything. No one asked why a war film was playing at full volume in the quietest part of the cabin. They heard it, of course, but chose not to intervene. Ariel wasn't surprised. People didn't get involved unless someone bled. And even then, it depended on who did the bleeding. She sank lower in her seat, eyes closed now, her hands gripping her knees under the tray table. She couldn't listen to her music. The war movie continued blaring beside Ariel like a storm with no pause button, but she no longer flinched at every explosion. She had learned to sit still through it, to let the violence play beside her while she disappeared into herself. Her earbuds, though functional again, could not drown it out completely, especially not with Brena raising the volume every few minutes under the pretense of better immersion. Ariel no longer even turned her head when that happened. She simply sank further into her seat, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the endless blue sky outside. Her mind was tired, not from the sound itself, but from the way every moment of this flight required endurance, as if existence itself demanded permission. But Brena wasn't finished. She didn't want silence. She wanted participation. She wanted performance. She wanted Ariel to react, to push back, to give her something that could be twisted into validation. And when that didn't happen, she changed her angle of attack. Leaning back with a stretch and a yawn, Brena tilted her head toward the woman seated diagonally across the aisle in 2C, a middle-aged woman with dark hair and a tense smile, the kind of person who paid attention but never interfered. "Pardon me," Brena said softly, in that same sugar-laced tone she had used on the attendants. "But have you noticed the girl next to me? She's been filming or photographing something with her phone." I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. The woman blinked. "Filming?" "Well," Brena replied, with a light shrug, "I didn't want to assume, but she's been very discreet with that camera. Very deliberate. Sometimes it's pointed at the cabin. Sometimes just at people. I'm sure it's nothing, but in today's world." "Well, you can't be too careful, right?" The woman in 2C glanced at Ariel, who sat hunched over with her earbuds in, clearly unaware of the exchange. The woman didn't say anything, just nodded faintly and returned to her magazine. But that was enough. Brena knew how suspicion worked. You didn't need proof. You just needed a whisper. And she had given that whisper legs. She didn't stop there. She shifted her body slightly toward Ariel, just enough to be heard without raising her voice, and said, "Your posture's very guarded, dear. You're not used to being around people, are you?" Ariel didn't respond. She stared forward, willing herself to remain a statue. No shame in that, Brena continued. Some children just don't grow up with the kind of structure that teaches them how to navigate social spaces, especially when the father isn't around. That one landed like a slap. Ariel turned her head, finally, and met Brena's eyes. But she didn't speak. Brena smiled. Oh, don't worry. I'm not judging. I work with children all the time. Some of them just need firm guidance, that's all. A little supervision. She reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a feedback card. I might jot something down for the crew, she added casually. Not a complaint, of course. Just an observation. These things help them serve everyone better. Ariel turned away again. Her throat was tight, too tight to swallow. The implication stung sharper than the words themselves. The suggestion that she wasn't just misbehaving, but neglected. That her existence was a red flag. That her presence here, on this plane, in this seat, in this moment, wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. She had no way to defend herself. No one had heard her voice in over an hour. No one had asked for it. And now, even her silence was being weaponized. The voices around Ariel had receded into a steady, distant hum, but the weight of them still clung to her skin like invisible dust. She sat perfectly still, not from discipline, but from pure, exhausted survival. Every movement, every blink, every breath felt like it had consequences now. Her muscles ached from the effort of shrinking herself smaller and smaller with each passing minute. She no longer tried to make eye contact with anyone, not even the attendants. It didn't matter. The verdict had already been passed, silently, socially, and completely. She was no longer a passenger. She was an anomaly to be observed, tolerated, managed. And worst of all, she knew it. That knowledge sat on her chest like a stone. She had kept herself together longer than most would have. But now even her restraint was fraying. Her breathing was shallow. Her fingers trembled. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, tears began to gather in her eyes. Not the kind that demanded attention, not the kind that broke with sound, but the kind that simply overflowed because they had nowhere else to go. She turned slightly, tucked her face toward the window, and let the tears fall silently down her cheek. Her hands remained in her lap. Her shoulders didn't shake. Her body didn't move. But the grief was real, raw, slow unraveling. Across the aisle, a passenger in row 3 glanced over. He was in his early 40s, wearing noise-canceling headphones and a branded fleece jacket. At first, he looked past her, then did a double take. He saw the tears, the hunched posture, the withdrawn gaze. But he didn't see the pain. He saw drama. He saw disruption. He saw something that didn't make sense in the curated order of first class. And so, with a reflex born not of malice, but of privilege, he pulled out his phone. Quietly, subtly, he began recording. From the angle of his seat, it looked like Ariel was sulking, maybe pouting, maybe filming, maybe building up to something. The assumptions filled the silence he didn't bother to question. The video didn't capture the context. It didn't show the wine-stained bag, the stolen lunch, the war movie at max volume, or the countless whispers planted like traps. It only showed a girl who looked upset and out of place. The man shook his head and muttered under his breath, "These kids," before saving the video and slipping his phone back into his pocket, already imagining the conversation it might spark in his friend group later. Ariel had no idea she was being filmed. She didn't care anymore. She had stopped hoping for fairness. Her only thought now was how to survive the next 3 hours without completely breaking. But the pressure was becoming unbearable. She needed to breathe, to stand, to move. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt, whispered an "excuse me" that Brena ignored entirely, and stepped into the aisle. Her feet moved on instinct, carrying her toward the restroom at the back of the first-class cabin. The hallway was narrow and cold, the air sharper than at her seat. She ducked into the lavatory, locked the door, and finally exhaled. A shuddering breath she hadn't allowed herself until now. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. Eyes red-rimmed, face drawn, shoulders too stiff for someone so young. She blinked rapidly, then reached into the small inner pocket of her jacket to retrieve her phone. But it wasn't there. Panic rising now, she unzipped the side compartments, dug through every zipper, every flap, every pocket. Nothing. Her phone, her last lifeline, was gone. Her hands trembled harder now, not from fear, but from disbelief. She had zipped it away herself. She remembered. She always kept it safe. She always checked twice. She never misplaced it. She closed her eyes, pressed her fists into her forehead, then forced herself to think. Maybe she dropped it. Maybe it slid under the seat. Maybe no. No maybes. She'd had it. Then it vanished. And in this cabin, things didn't just vanish. They were taken. She turned toward the tiny trash bin built into the wall of the lavatory. With shaking hands, she flipped the lid and stared down into the narrow chute. There, wedged between a used paper towel and a napkin stained with lipstick, was the edge of something sleek and black. Her breath caught. She reached in, heart hammering, and pulled it out. Her phone, 0020, smelling faintly of disinfectant. Her hand shook as she wiped it on her sleeve, praying it still worked. She pressed the power button. The screen flickered. The Apple logo appeared. Then a black screen. Then nothing. She stared at the blank screen for a long time, her fingers frozen, her body still. This wasn't just sabotage. This was erasure. Someone had made a decision. She didn't deserve a voice. Not even the quiet one in her pocket. She stood there for another minute, unmoving. Then she put the phone gently in her bag, straightened her back, and wiped her face one last time. Ariel exited the lavatory with slow, even steps. Her face wiped clean, but her expression hollow. The silence in her chest was heavier now, not because the chaos had stopped, but because she had stopped fighting it. She no longer felt the sting of humiliation, only the weight of it, like a thick coat she couldn't take off. Her phone, cold and useless, sat deep inside her bag like a broken promise. She walked back to her seat with the gait of someone who had nothing left to lose. Brena didn't glance at her. Neither did anyone else. That was the part that cut deepest, not the hatred, but the absence of concern, the indifference. As if she were already invisible, already erased. She sat down, pulled her sweatshirt into her lap, and stared at the seat back in front of her without blinking. Minutes passed, maybe more. She didn't care. Her mind looped through fragments. Her mother packing lunch. Her father's reassuring voice that morning. The sound of her name being said with kindness. None of it felt real now. All of it felt far away. Until the ache in her chest pushed through, sharp and sudden, and she realized she had to do something. Anything. Before she fully disappeared. She sat up straighter and pressed the call button above her seat. The light blinked for several seconds before a new attendant approached. A man in his early 30s, clean-cut, friendly eyes dulled by long hours. "Yes, miss?" he asked, slightly distracted. Ariel took a breath and steadied her voice. "I need to make a call," she said. "It's an emergency." The man hesitated. "I'm sorry, but we don't allow phone use mid-flight, and we can't authorize cabin calls for personal reasons unless it's not personal." Ariel cut in, louder than she meant to. "My phone's been stolen. I'm a minor traveling alone. I'm being harassed. I need to call my father. Now." The attendant blinked, the words catching him off guard. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, "but I'm not safe either." Her voice trembled, and she hated it, but she didn't stop. "I need to speak to my dad. He's federal law enforcement." The man paused longer this time. "What agency?" "FBI," she said, her voice catching on the second syllable. "Special Agent Silas Thorne. Please. He'll verify everything." The attendant still looked unsure, but something in her eyes, something raw and desperate and honest, made him nod. "Wait here," he said, and walked quickly toward the front of the cabin. Ariel clutched her sweatshirt tighter, her breath shallow. A moment later, he returned and gestured for her to follow. She stood slowly, legs unsteady, and walked with him toward the galley, past indifferent passengers and blinking lights. The senior attendant met them there, holding a secure line phone with a long coiled cord. "This is only for emergencies," she said, her tone clipped. "1 minute." Ariel took the receiver, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. The attendant dialed. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then Agent Thorne. His voice cut through the line like steel. For the first time since boarding, Ariel let herself cry. "Daddy," she whispered, then choked on the word. "Daddy, please, I need help." Silence on the other end. Then, "Ari, what happened? Are you hurt?" "No," she gasped. "But I'm alone. They've been." She's been saying things, doing things. "I can't, my phone's gone. I think she threw it away. They keep looking at me like I don't belong. No one's helping. I didn't do anything." Silas Thorne didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Where are you?" "Flight 769. Boston to Seattle," Ariel replied between sobs. "First class. Seat 2A. A pause, then, "Stay where you are. Do not move. I'm on it." The line went dead. Ariel stared at the receiver for a second before handing it back, her shoulders trembling. The attendants said nothing. They didn't ask what he said. They didn't offer comfort. They simply led her back to her seat, their expressions suddenly unreadable. Brena didn't glance her way. No fake concern. No new taunt. Perhaps she assumed the girl had called her mother. Perhaps she believed no one would listen, as they hadn't before. But the look in Ariel's eyes had changed, and for the first time, it was not fear holding her in place. It was patience. The plane flew steady through the sky, but turbulence of another kind was about to shake the cabin. In the forward galley, the senior flight attendant was no longer serving drinks or organizing meal carts. She stood stiffly beside the first officer's door, a satellite phone still in her hand, her brow furrowed deep as she listened through the secure channel. "Repeat authorization code," the voice said in her earpiece. She gave it, word for word, digit for digit, and waited. Then a second voice, this one harder, faster, male, cut in from a different channel. "This is Special Agent Harrison, Liaison for Airborne Federal Response. We've received a formal notification from Agent Silas Thorne regarding an active harassment case aboard Flight 769. Target is a minor, C2A. Alleged aggressor seated adjacent, to be named possibly Brena Howcroft. Orders are as follows. Initiate non-confrontational surveillance immediately. Flight crew is to maintain cabin status quo. Do not alert suspect. Pilot to be notified and identity to be confirmed. Await further instructions upon descent." The attendant's lips parted slightly. She had handled drunk passengers, medical emergencies, even a minor fire once. But never this. Never Federal Code midair. "Copy," she said simply, then lowered the receiver and walked, not briskly, but with purpose, toward the cockpit. 2 knocks. The door slid open. She disappeared inside. Ariel sat frozen in her seat, unaware of the ripple that was beginning to move beneath her. She had told herself not to expect anything, not to hope. But deep down, she still wondered if anyone would take her seriously, if the call had meant something. She didn't know what her father had said, but she would soon find out. Inside the cockpit, the captain listened with a stony expression as the senior attendant relayed the orders. He reached for a secure terminal and pulled up the passenger manifest. "Howcroft, Brena," and he read aloud. "Confirmed in 2B. Frequent flyer. Platinum tier. Boarded in Boston. No current red flags." "That's about to change," the attendant replied. "FBI wants surveillance logged from this point forward." The captain nodded, keyed in a command, and quietly activated the forward cabin's internal monitoring feed. A small square monitor near the control panel lit up, with a clean, high-resolution angle of row 2. Both seats, both faces, sound enabled. Back in first class, nothing had changed visibly. Brena continued browsing her tablet, scrolling through real estate listings as if nothing existed beyond her screen. Ariel stared blankly ahead, her hands folded in her lap, trying not to draw attention, trying not to tremble. But now eyes were watching. Eyes from behind steel doors and encrypted headsets, from satellite link control rooms hundreds of miles away, where agents tracked threats that didn't show up on scanners. The girl in 2A was no longer alone. A new attendant passed by and subtly dropped a small slip of paper into the senior attendant's hand. It had been printed just seconds ago from the cockpit's secure line. The note was simple: confirmed. Target valid. Proceed as instructed. Do not engage unless suspect escalates. She folded it in half and tucked it into her apron, her eyes narrowing as she looked down the cabin. Brena glanced up briefly as the attendant passed, offered a tight-lipped smile, and said, "I'd love some tea when you have a chance." "Of course," the attendant replied smoothly, then turned back toward the galley. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply moved with the kind of focus that said she knew more than she could say. In row 3, the man who had filmed Ariel earlier was reviewing the video on his phone. He frowned. Somehow, it didn't look as dramatic as he'd imagined. The girl didn't cry like he remembered. She looked tired. Not dangerous. Just tired. He deleted the file without saving it. Maybe it hadn't been worth it. Minutes passed. Ariel remained still, her heart pounding in a slow, steady rhythm. Something was different. She could feel it. The energy in the cabin had shifted, not in the way it had before, with stares and side glances, but in the way trained people get quiet when they're waiting for a signal. When things become real. Then, quietly, a new voice came over the cabin intercom. Not the usual recorded announcement, but the calm baritone of the captain himself. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent into Seattle shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." His tone didn't betray anything. But to the crew, it meant one thing: final phase. Brena didn't seem to notice. She closed her tablet, stretched again, and said aloud to no one in particular, "Finally. This flight has been exhausting. Some of us just want a little peace and quiet." Her tone was still smug, still composed. But her time was running out. The seatbelt light dinged softly as the captain's voice faded, and the plane began its gentle descent through a sky painted in fading gold. The clouds thinned, and the city lights of Seattle glittered faintly below, like an audience waiting in the dark for the final act to begin. In first class, the atmosphere had turned quiet in a way that wasn't quite natural. It wasn't the silence of peace or sleep, but the taut hush of a room holding its breath. The senior flight attendant moved calmly through the aisle, double-checking latches and trays. But her eyes were sharper now, her steps more precise. She stopped briefly at row 2, glancing at both seats, then moved on without a word. Brena, unaware of the storm gathering outside the fuselage, casually reapplied her lipstick using the small mirror tucked into her wallet. "About time," she muttered, adjusting her hair. "This whole experience has been taxing." Ariel sat beside her in perfect silence, her face expressionless, but her fingers gently tapped against her knee, 3 slow beats at a time, the rhythm her father taught her as a grounding technique. She didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. But she felt still, and that was enough. The wheels of the aircraft touched down with a soft shudder, and the cabin responded with its usual symphony of sighs, seatbelts unclasping. Overhead, bins creaking open. The intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't the captain. It was the senior flight attendant's voice, cool, clear, and unusually direct. "Passengers in rows 1 and 2, please remain seated. Airport personnel will assist you shortly. All others may deplane as normal." Confused glances were exchanged. Some paused in the aisle. A few continued off the plane. Ariel didn't move. Brena glanced toward the galley and back. "Is that for us?" she asked aloud, frowning. "What kind of priority system is this?" Her voice had lost a degree of its smugness, now tinged with irritation. 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the front of the cabin, stepping through the entrance with quiet authority. They wore black polos and tactical slacks, with airport security credentials clipped at the waist. Between them stood a man in a dark gray suit, tall, clean-shaven, and unmistakably federal. Ariel saw him before Brena did, and her heart skipped, not in fear, but in recognition. Agent Silas Thorne, her father. His presence filled the cabin without a word. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on his daughter's, offering the briefest nod, not of affection, but of affirmation. "You did well. I'm here now." Brena straightened in her seat, her body tensing as if finally sensing something was wrong. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "What's going on here? I don't appreciate being made to wait while others disembark." Silas didn't respond to her. Instead, he turned to the attendant. "Is she still in 2B?" "Yes, sir," the attendant answered crisply. "We've logged everything. Surveillance is intact." "Good." Silas finally looked at Brena, his gaze cold and analytical. "Ms. Howcroft, you are being detained for questioning in connection with multiple violations of the Federal Passenger Conduct Act, including harassment of a minor, interference with airline crew duties, and potential tampering with property in a sealed cabin." Brena blinked, visibly stunned. "What?" she said, her voice faltering. "This is ridiculous. I haven't done anything. That girl, she's been acting strange since boarding. I was only trying to help." Silas didn't flinch. "You're not under arrest yet, but you are being removed from this aircraft by federal authority. You will comply, or you will be charged with obstruction." The officers stepped forward. One placed a firm hand on Brena's shoulder. She pulled away reflexively, eyes darting between passengers, suddenly aware that the entire cabin was watching. "This is a mistake," she said, louder now. "I'm a platinum member. I know people. I'll have your badge. You can address that in your statement." One of the officers cut in smoothly. "Now please stand." The moment cracked. Brena rose with forced composure, but her eyes had gone wild, her hands shaking slightly. Her entire aura, the practiced poise, the measured grace, fractured like glass under pressure. As she was escorted toward the front, a flight attendant gently stepped in beside Ariel and whispered, "Stay seated just a moment, dear." Ariel nodded. She watched Brena walk past, surrounded by silence that had now turned from complicit to condemning. No one defended her. No one applauded. No one offered sympathy. She exited the cabin not as a victim or even as a woman of status, but as something worse in this world, an exposed fraud. Once Brena had cleared the jet bridge, Silas stepped into row 2, knelt beside his daughter, and finally let the cold drop from his voice. "Are you okay?" Ariel looked at him, her eyes still red but dry. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." "I always will," he said simply. He stood, offered his hand, and helped her up. As she stepped into the aisle, the senior attendant straightened her posture. The other crew members formed a quiet line near the exit. None of them spoke, but they all nodded as she passed, a silent gesture of respect that said, "We see you now." Outside the terminal, reporters wouldn't come for days. But the fallout began immediately. Brena Howcroft's name hit the incident report within hours. Her platinum membership was revoked before sunrise. A civil rights attorney filed suit on Ariel's behalf that same week. Investigations into similar passenger complaints began to surface. Her photo was quietly circulated among crew forums as a red flag flyer. And Ariel? She walked beside her father, out into the Seattle air, no longer invisible, no longer alone. The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe for more powerful content like this. Which part hit you the hardest? Was it when Ariel made that heartbreaking call, or when Brena finally got what she deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one.